November 12, 1944. The transport truck rolled through the gates of Camp Mitchell, Massachusetts, carrying cargo that would challenge everything the American military thought they understood about prisoner management. Inside sat 43 women wearing the remnants of German Women's Auxiliary Corps uniforms, their faces masks of exhaustion and carefully maintained dignity. They had been captured 3 weeks earlier as Allied forces pushed through Belgium, serving in communications and medical capacities behind rapidly collapsing German lines. Now they faced an uncertain future in enemy captivity, thousands of miles from everything they had ever known. Captain Margaret Sullivan stood in the cold November drizzle, watching as the truck came to a stop in the center of the compound. She had commanded this facility for 18 months, overseeing the detention of Italian and German male prisoners without incident. But this assignment felt different. The War Department had given her less than 48 hours' notice that her camp would be converted to house female prisoners, a situation so unusual that no standard protocols existed. She clutched a thin folder containing vague instructions and even vaguer guidance about how to proceed. The truck's canvas covering was pulled back, and the women began to descend. Captain Sullivan noticed immediately how they moved with military precision despite their obvious fatigue. They formed ranks without being told, standing straighter than many of her own soldiers. Among them was 24-year-old Edith Zimmerman, a communications specialist from Dresden who had joined the Women's Auxiliary Corps in 1942, believing she was contributing to her country's defense. She carried nothing but a small canvas bag containing a change of undergarments, a wooden comb, and a photograph of her family taken before the war when smiles had come more easily. The women's gray uniforms bore the marks of hasty retreat and capture. Some had torn sleeves or missing buttons. Others showed stains from the muddy Belgian roads where they had been apprehended. But what struck Captain Sullivan most was their eyes. She had expected defiance or fear. Instead, she saw something more complex, a mixture of resignation, uncertainty, and a carefully guarded wariness that suggested these women had already begun calculating how to survive. Whatever came next, Sergeant Robert Chen, whose parents had immigrated from China 30 years earlier, stood beside Captain Sullivan with the intake paperwork. He had volunteered for this assignment partly out of curiosity and partly because he understood what it meant to be perceived as foreign, as other. He watched as the German women registered their surroundings, noting the wire fences, the guard towers, and the barracks that would become their home for an indefinite period. Among the group, Kristen Neumann, a 23-year-old nurse from Hamburg, noticed the American flag hanging limply in the November rain. She had been taught that this symbol represented a nation of gangsters and warmongers, yet the faces of the soldiers watching them showed more curiosity than hatred. It was her first hint that perhaps everything she had been told about America might not be entirely true. The barracks smelled of fresh paint and disinfectant, evidence of the hurried preparations made to convert the facility for female occupants. 20 metal cots lined each wall, covered with thin mattresses and scratchy wool blankets that bore the stamp of the United States Army. The women filed in silently, each choosing a bed with the same military efficiency they had displayed during formation. There was no conversation, no complaints, only the sound of canvas bags being placed on footlockers and the creak of bed frames as exhausted bodies finally sat down. Edith chose a cot near the window, drawn instinctively to the small square of fading daylight. She placed her canvas bag on the footlocker and sat carefully, testing the mattress. It was firmer than she expected, nothing like the straw pallets they had slept on during their last weeks in Belgium. She ran her hand over the blanket, noting its weight and warmth. In the chaos of retreat and capture, she had grown accustomed to sleeping in whatever shelter could be found, often cold, always uncertain. This felt almost luxurious by comparison, which troubled her in ways she could not quite articulate. Krista sat on the cot beside her, and the two women exchanged a brief glance that communicated volumes without words. They had met only 3 days earlier during the transport from the East Coast Processing Center. But already they had developed the silent understanding that forms between people sharing extreme circumstances. Krista's hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her uniform, a nervous gesture she had developed since their capture. Across the room, 26-year-old Inga Schwartz, a radio operator from Berlin, sat rigidly on her cot, her posture perfect despite obvious exhaustion. She had been in the military longer than most of the others, having joined in 1941 when the war still seemed like something Germany could win. Now she found herself responsible for maintaining morale among women who looked to her for guidance she no longer felt qualified to give. How could she lead when she herself had no idea what tomorrow would bring? The barracks door opened, and Captain Sullivan entered with 2 female American soldiers. The room fell completely silent. Sullivan surveyed the women with an expression that was neither harsh nor sympathetic, simply observant. She spoke in clear, slow English, knowing most would not understand but believing it important to establish the routine from the beginning. Tomorrow, you will receive full instructions about camp procedures. Tonight, you will be brought dinner at 1800 hours. Lights out is at 2100 hours. Do you have any immediate medical emergencies? Sergeant Chen, who had followed her in, repeated the announcement in halting German. His pronunciation was imperfect, clearly learned from books rather than conversation, but the effort itself was surprising. Several of the women exchanged glances. Why would an American soldier bother to learn their language? What did it mean that their captors were making this small gesture toward communication? The announcement came the following morning during roll call. All prisoners would take their meals in the main mess hall beginning that evening. Captain Sullivan delivered the news in English, while Sergeant Chen translated, his German improving slightly with each attempt. The women listened with carefully neutral expressions, but Edith noticed how Inga's jaw tightened at the words. Eating in front of their captors felt vulnerable, exposing them in ways that went beyond the physical act of consuming food. Throughout the day, whispered conversations filled the barracks during brief moments when the guards were not watching closely. The women speculated about what American prison food would be like. Most assumed it would be minimal, perhaps watered-down soup and hard bread. The kind of rations they had heard were given to prisoners in German camps. Laura Fischer, a 21-year-old administrative clerk from Munich, mentioned that her brother had written about Red Cross parcels before his letters stopped coming. Maybe the Americans would provide something similar. Basic sustenance meant only to keep them alive and able to work. Renate Müller, 22 years old and formerly responsible for supply coordination, tried to remember everything she had been taught about America during her training. The propaganda had painted a picture of a nation depleted by war, struggling to feed its own soldiers, certainly not capable of providing well for enemy prisoners. She had seen photographs distributed by her superiors showing breadlines in American cities during the Depression. Surely a country that had experienced such deprivation would not waste resources on captured enemies. As 1800 hours approached, the women were lined up and marched across the compound to the mess hall. The building was larger than their barracks, with windows that let in the late afternoon light. Long tables with attached benches filled the space, already occupied by American soldiers who paused their conversations to watch as the German women entered. The scrutiny was uncomfortable, but not hostile. The Americans seemed more curious than anything else, observing these unusual prisoners with the same interest one might show toward an unexpected phenomenon. Captain Sullivan directed them to tables that had been set apart from where the American soldiers sat, a separation that felt both relieving and isolating. The women took their seats in silence, backs straight, hands folded in their laps. They had been trained to maintain dignity under all circumstances, and they would not give their captors the satisfaction of seeing them appear weak or desperate, regardless of how hungry they actually were. Private James Morrison, a farm boy from Iowa assigned to mess hall duty, watched from near the kitchen doors, noting how thin most of the women looked despite their proud bearing. The kitchen doors swung open, and American soldiers began bringing out trays. Edith watched as the first tray was set on the table nearest to where she sat. Her breath caught. The tray held plates filled with more food than she had seen in a single meal in over a year. Golden brown casserole, vegetables glistening with butter, thick slices of white bread, and portions that seemed impossibly generous. She glanced at Krista, whose eyes had widened in disbelief. More trays arrived, one for each table where German women sat. The portions were identical to what the American soldiers were receiving at their own tables, no distinction made between captor and captive. Steam rose from the casseroles, carrying an aroma that made Edith's stomach clench with sudden, overwhelming hunger. She had grown accustomed to ignoring her body's demands, but the smell of real food, abundant food, broke through her carefully maintained control. Inge leaned forward slightly, studying the dish before them. The top was golden and crispy, clearly baked until perfectly done. Through the gaps in the crust, she could see chunks of something white mixed with pasta, all bound together in a creamy sauce. Small green vegetables were visible throughout. It looked nothing like the thin soups and black bread that had sustained them during the final chaotic months in Belgium. This looked like something served at a celebration, a feast day meal prepared with care and generous ingredients. Renate whispered in German, barely audible. Is this some kind of test? Perhaps the Americans wanted to see if they would behave like animals, grabbing and eating without restraint. Or maybe this was a cruel joke, food that would be taken away before they could touch it, a demonstration of American abundance meant to demoralize them further. She kept her hands carefully folded, waiting for instructions, for permission, for some indication of what was expected. Private Morrison approached their table carrying a pitcher of water and clean glasses. He set them down gently and gestured toward the food with a slight smile. Hot, he said, pointing at the casserole. Careful. The women stared at him, uncertain how to interpret this warning. Was he concerned they might burn themselves? The idea that an enemy soldier would care about such a small thing seemed incomprehensible. Morrison noticed their hesitation and made an eating gesture, trying to communicate that they should begin. Still, no one moved. Captain Sullivan, observing from across the mess hall, recognized the paralysis. She had seen it before with newly arrived prisoners, the inability to trust that kindness might be genuine. She walked over to their table and spoke clearly. This is your dinner. Please eat. Sergeant Chen translated, adding his own reassurance. This is normal food. Everyone eats the same. Edith picked up her fork with trembling fingers. The metal felt solid and clean, nothing like the battered utensils they had used during their final weeks in Belgium. She cut through the golden crust of the casserole, and steam escaped, carrying the rich scent of cream and fish. The first bite was almost overwhelming. The pasta was tender, cooked perfectly. The sauce was creamy and flavored with something she could not quite identify, and there was tuna, real fish, flaked throughout in generous amounts. She chewed slowly, trying to process what she was tasting. Around the table, other women had begun to eat, their initial hesitation overcome by hunger and the undeniable reality of the food before them. Krista took a small bite, then another larger one. Tears began to stream down her face, though she made no sound. The combination of genuine hunger finally being satisfied and the emotional weight of unexpected kindness had broken through her carefully maintained composure. She was not alone. Several other women were crying silently as they ate, their tears falling onto plates filled with more food than they had seen in months. Laura whispered to Inge in German, her voice filled with confusion. Why would they give us this? This is feast food. This is what you serve on Easter or Christmas, not to prisoners. Inge had no answer. She had been trained to expect harsh treatment from enemies, minimal rations designed only to sustain life and work capacity. This abundant meal contradicted everything she thought she understood about how wars were conducted, about how enemies treated those they had defeated and captured. Renate studied the American soldiers eating at nearby tables, They consumed the same casserole with casual efficiency, talking and laughing as they ate. For them, this was clearly ordinary food, nothing special or celebratory. The realization was staggering. If this was what Americans considered a regular meal, what did that say about the abundance of this country? What did it mean about the propaganda she had been taught? About America being a struggling nation depleted by war and unable to care for its own people? The bread was soft and white, nothing like the dense, dark loaves mixed with sawdust that had become standard in Germany. Edith spread butter on a slice, real butter, golden and rich. She had not tasted butter in over 8 months. The vegetables were cooked but still retained their color and texture, seasoned with salt and pepper and what might have been herbs. Every element of the meal spoke of resources and care that seemed impossible to reconcile with her understanding of wartime privation. The meal continued in relative silence, broken only by the quiet sounds of eating and the occasional murmured comment in German. Edith found herself eating more slowly as her initial hunger subsided, allowing herself to actually taste each component of the casserole rather than simply consuming it. The pasta had a pleasant texture, neither too soft nor too firm. The tuna was flaked throughout in pieces large enough to identify, but small enough to blend with the creamy sauce. She noticed small bits of celery, adding a subtle crunch, and there was a seasoning she could not quite place that gave the dish a savory depth. Across the mess hall, Private Morrison watched the German women eat with quiet satisfaction. He had helped prepare this meal, peeling potatoes and opening the large cans of tuna under the supervision of the camp cook. When he had learned they were feeding German prisoners, he had wondered if they would be given different rations, something less than what the American soldiers received. The cook, a heavy-set man from Pennsylvania named Frank, had looked at him as if he had asked something ridiculous. "They eat what we eat," Frank had said firmly. "Geneva Convention says so, but more than that, it is just human decency. You do not starve people just because they were on the other side." That philosophy seemed to guide everything about how Camp Mitchell operated. Morrison had been stationed here for 7 months, and he had never witnessed deliberate cruelty toward prisoners. Firm discipline when necessary, yes. Clear boundaries and rules, absolutely. But the casual dehumanization he had heard about in some camps simply did not exist here. Captain Sullivan ran the facility with the belief that treating prisoners with basic dignity was not a weakness, but rather a demonstration of American values, proof that democracy produced better outcomes than tyranny, even in something as mundane as prison management. Krista had stopped crying, though her eyes remained red. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and continued eating, forcing herself to slow down, despite wanting to consume everything on her plate as quickly as possible. Beside her, Edith noticed the change and reached over to briefly touch her arm, a small gesture of solidarity. They were strangers, brought together by circumstances neither had chosen, but they were beginning to recognize that survival in this place might require supporting one another rather than retreating into isolated silence. Inga finished her portion and sat back, her plate completely clean. She had not left a single bite, partly from hunger and partly from years of training, that wasting food was both immoral and impractical. But now, sitting in the warm mess hall, with her stomach full for the first time in recent memory, she felt something unexpected. Not gratitude, not yet, that would require too much mental adjustment. But perhaps the first small crack in the certainty she had carried about who the Americans were and what they represented. If they were truly the monsters German propaganda had described, would they feed their prisoners this well? Renate looked at the empty plates around their table and then at the American soldiers still eating their own meals. The portions had been genuinely equal, she was certain of that now. No one had given the prisoners smaller servings or inferior quality. This was simply how Americans ate, with an abundance that seemed almost careless to someone who had spent the last 2 years watching rations shrink and food quality decline in Germany. That night in the barracks, the women could not sleep despite their exhaustion. Hushed conversations filled the darkness. women processing what they had experienced during that first meal. Laura lay on her cot, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with questions she had no way to answer. If the Americans could afford to feed prisoners this well, what did that say about their overall capacity to wage war? How could Germany hope to defeat a nation with such resources that even its enemies ate better than German soldiers in the field? Edith listened to the whispered conversations around her, hearing the same confusion and disorientation in other voices that she felt in her own thoughts. Everything they had been taught, everything the propaganda had told them about America being weak and depleted, seemed contradicted by something as simple as a tuna casserole. She thought about the newsreels she had watched before joining the Women's Auxiliary Corps. Images of American cities in decay, breadlines during the Depression, claims that democracy had failed and left its people starving. Where was that America? The one she had encountered today bore no resemblance to those descriptions. Krista spoke softly from the next cot. My brother wrote to me in 1942, before his letters stopped. He was in North Africa, fighting the British. He said the American supplies they captured were incredible. Chocolate, cigarettes, canned goods, in amounts that seemed impossible. We thought he was exaggerating, trying to make his situation seem less desperate. But maybe he was telling the truth. Maybe we simply could not believe it because it contradicted everything we had been taught to accept as fact. Ing, lying several cots away, heard Krista's words and felt her chest tighten. She had dismissed similar reports from her own cousins serving on the Eastern Front. They had written about captured Soviet positions, supplied with American equipment, trucks and weapons, and food, all bearing the stamps of a nation that was supposedly struggling to survive. She had assumed the letters were being influenced by defeatist thinking, a lack of proper morale. Now she wondered if she had been the one lacking proper understanding, if her loyalty to the Reich had blinded her to uncomfortable truths about the war's actual trajectory. Renate sat up on her cot, unable to remain still. Her mind kept returning to the butter, real butter, spread thick on soft white bread. In Germany, butter had become a luxury reserved for party officials and high-ranking military officers. Ordinary citizens made do with margarine when they could get it, and often went without entirely. Yet here, in a prison camp, it was served casually to enemies as if it were nothing special. The cognitive dissonance was almost painful. A voice came from the darkness near the door. Perhaps it is a trick. The speaker was a woman Edith did not know well, someone who had kept mostly to herself since their arrival. Perhaps they feed us well now to make us compliant, to make us forget who we are. Then later, when we are comfortable, they will change. They will show their true nature. The suggestion was met with silence, not because it was convincing, but because it offered a framework for understanding that preserved their existing worldview. It was easier to believe in delayed cruelty than to accept that their fundamental understanding of the enemy might be wrong. Morning came with the sharp sound of a whistle calling the women to assembly for their first full day of camp routine. After roll call, Captain Sullivan announced work assignments. Following Geneva Convention protocols, prisoners could be assigned labor duties that did not directly support the war effort. Some women would work in laundry, others in basic maintenance. A smaller group would assist in the kitchen under supervision. Edith found her name on the kitchen assignment list, along with Krista, Renata, and 3 other women she barely knew. Private Morrison led them to the kitchen, a large space filled with industrial stoves, massive sinks, and storage areas lined with shelves. The camp cook, Frank, stood at a central preparation table, his sleeves rolled up and an apron tied around his substantial middle. He looked at the German women with an appraising eye, then spoke in slow, clear English. "Welcome to my kitchen. You follow instructions, you work hard, you learn how we do things here." Sergeant Chen translated, though his German remained imperfect enough that some meaning was lost in transmission. Frank began showing them the storage areas, opening doors to reveal shelves stocked with canned goods, in quantities that made Renate audibly gasp. Rows of tuna cans, vegetables, fruits, all bearing labels from American companies she had never heard of. Sacks of flour, sugar, and rice were stacked neatly in a dry storage room. A separate cool room held fresh vegetables, potatoes, carrots, and onions. The abundance was staggering, more food in this single kitchen than she had seen in the entire supply depot she had managed in Belgium during the final months before their retreat. Edith watched as Frank pulled out ingredients for that day's lunch preparation. He worked with the casual confidence of someone who had never had to worry about whether supplies would arrive or whether rations would be cut. He measured ingredients generously, not with the careful rationing she had learned to practice. When he cracked eggs into a bowl, he did so without the precious care she would have used, treating them as ordinary rather than luxury items. The contrast was jarring. Krista was assigned to vegetable preparation, given a knife, and shown how to peel potatoes. As she worked, she noticed that the peels she was removing were thick, wasteful by German standards where every bit of food had become precious. She tried to peel more thinly, to conserve, but Frank noticed and corrected her. No, he demonstrated, like this. Thicker peels came off easily under his practiced hands. In America, apparently, efficiency mattered more than absolute conservation because there was always more food available. The assumption of abundance shaped every aspect of how they worked. Renate found herself stationed near the large metal cans of tuna, preparing to help make another casserole. She counted the cans Frank pulled from the shelf. 12 large cans for one meal, each containing more tuna than her entire family might have consumed in a month back home. This was not special occasion food. This was Tuesday lunch, ordinary and unremarkable to the Americans who would consume it without appreciating the minor miracle of plenty that it represented. The kitchen work became routine over the following weeks. Each day, Edith and the other German women assigned to this duty would spend morning hours helping prepare meals under Frank's supervision. The work was physically demanding, but not cruel, and it offered something valuable beyond the labor itself. It provided a window into how Americans actually lived, what they considered normal and ordinary rather than exceptional. Every meal they prepared reinforced the same unsettling truth that abundance was not propaganda or exaggeration, but simply American reality. Private Morrison had taken it upon himself to help the German women learn English. During quiet moments in the kitchen when Frank was occupied elsewhere, he would point to objects and slowly pronounce their English names. Potato, knife, bowl, oven. The women would repeat the words, their accents heavy, but their effort genuine. Edith discovered she had an aptitude for languages, picking up vocabulary quickly and beginning to construct simple sentences within the first 2 weeks. Morrison seemed pleased by their progress, offering encouragement rather than criticism when they made mistakes. One morning, Krista arrived at the kitchen with a persistent cough she had been fighting for several days. The November cold had settled into her chest, making breathing difficult and sleep nearly impossible. She tried to hide her discomfort, not wanting to be separated from the work assignment she had come to value. But Frank noticed immediately. He studied her flushed face and listened to her labored breathing before making a decision. He sent her to the camp infirmary with Morrison as escort, instructing her not to return until the medical officer cleared her. Dr. Robert Hayes examined Krista with professional efficiency. He was a middle-aged physician from Boston who had volunteered for military service despite being old enough to avoid the draft. He listened to her lungs, took her temperature, and asked questions that Morrison translated. Bronchitis, he diagnosed. Not severe yet, but it would become so without treatment. He prescribed rest, warm liquids, and a course of sulfa drugs that were still relatively new, but proving effective against bacterial infections. The idea that a German prisoner would receive the same medical treatment as an American soldier seemed impossible to Krista, yet here was the evidence in the form of pills dispensed with instructions for proper dosage. Back in the barracks, word spread about Krista's treatment. Other women who had been suffering minor ailments in silence began to reconsider whether they might also receive genuine medical care. Laura, who had been dealing with an infected cut on her hand, finally asked to see Dr. Hayes. He cleaned and dressed the wound properly, providing antibiotic ointment and fresh bandages. He showed her how to change the dressing herself and told her, through Morrison's translation, to return if she noticed any signs of worsening infection. The small kindness of proper medical attention felt disproportionately significant to women who had been taught to expect neglect or worse from their enemies. December brought the first letters from Germany, delivered through the International Red Cross system that allowed limited communication between prisoners and their families. Not every woman received mail. The chaos of the collapsing Reich meant that many families had been displaced or were unreachable. But for those who did receive letters, the news was universally devastating. Edith sat on her cot holding a thin envelope that had traveled across the Atlantic, postmarked from Dresden 3 months earlier. Her hands shook as she opened it. The letter was from her aunt, writing on behalf of the family, because Edith's mother was too distraught to hold a pen. Her brother Klaus, serving with an infantry division on the Eastern Front, had been killed in action near Warsaw in August. Her father, who had worked in a factory producing ball bearings, had died during an Allied bombing raid in October. The apartment building where her family had lived for 3 generations was rubble. Her mother and younger sister had relocated to her aunt's farm outside the city, crowded into a small house with 12 other displaced relatives surviving on increasingly meager rations and the vegetables they could grow in a garden. The letter ended with a question that pierced through Edith's chest like a physical wound. "When will you come home? We need you." There was no anger about her capture, no shame, just the desperate plea of a family that had lost too much and could not bear to lose more. Edith read the letter 3 times, then carefully folded it and placed it back in the envelope. She lay down on her cot, turned her face to the wall, and wept silently for the first time since her capture. Krista's letter brought similar news. Her parents' bakery in Hamburg, a business her grandfather had established in 1879, had been destroyed in the firebombing raids. Her parents had survived but were living in a refugee shelter with hundreds of others, waiting for housing assignments that might never come. Her 2 younger brothers, both serving in the Wehrmacht, had not been heard from in over 6 months. The authorities listed them as missing, a designation that meant almost certainly dead but could not be officially confirmed. Inga received no letter at all, which somehow felt worse than bad news. Her family in Berlin existed in a state of Schrödinger's uncertainty, simultaneously alive and dead, until information reached her to resolve the question one way or another. She watched other women reading their letters and envied even those receiving devastating news because at least they knew. At least they could begin to process their grief rather than existing in suspended animation, unable to mourn or hope with any certainty. Renate's letter contained an unexpected element that complicated her grief. Her mother wrote that Renate's fiancé, a Luftwaffe pilot she had been engaged to since 1942, had been killed when his fighter was shot down over France. But the tone of the letter suggested something her mother did not say directly. There was relief mixed with the sorrow, relief that Renate had been spared a marriage to a man who had become increasingly committed to Nazi ideology, who had spoken approvingly of actions that Renate's mother found morally troubling. The subtext was clear even across thousands of miles. Your capture may have saved you from a future you would have regretted. The revelation came during a routine kitchen shift in mid-December. Edith had been working alongside Private Morrison for several weeks, and her English had improved enough for basic conversation. As they prepared vegetables for that evening's meal, Morrison mentioned casually that his mother back in Iowa made tuna casserole at least twice a month. It was cheap, he explained, easy to make in large quantities, and good for stretching the budget when money was tight. His family was not poor, but farming did not generate the kind of income that allowed for expensive meals every night. Edith stopped cutting carrots and stared at him. Twice a month? This food that had seemed like a feast, that had overwhelmed her with its abundance on that first night, was actually what Americans considered economical? Morrison, noticing her shocked expression, continued explaining. During the Depression, his mother had relied heavily on casseroles because they could incorporate whatever ingredients were available and feed a large family without much meat. Tuna was cheaper than beef or chicken, and the pasta and cream sauce made a little protein go a long way. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. What Edith had interpreted as generosity, as proof of American abundance, was actually their version of frugal cooking. If this was what Americans made when they were being economical, what did their truly abundant meals look like? Morrison, sensing her confusion, tried to explain further. He described Sunday dinners at his family's farm with roasted chicken, multiple vegetable dishes, fresh bread, butter, and pie for dessert. He talked about Thanksgiving meals that included turkey, ham, stuffing, potatoes prepared 3 different ways, and an array of desserts that seemed almost obscene in their variety. Krista, working nearby and understanding enough English to follow the conversation, felt tears threatening again. She thought about the last Christmas dinner her family had shared in Hamburg, 1943, before her bakery-owning parents could no longer obtain the ingredients for traditional holiday baking. They had eaten potatoes and a small portion of questionable sausage, pretending it was festive while avoiding mentioning the sons who were absent, fighting on distant fronts. She had thought it was a respectable meal given wartime conditions. Now she understood it would have seemed desperately meager by American standards, even Depression-era American standards. Frank, the cook, overheard the conversation and decided to add his perspective. He explained that military food was actually less abundant than what most Americans ate at home. The Army had to balance nutrition with cost and logistics, feeding thousands of men efficiently. Tuna casserole was a staple precisely because it met those requirements: nutritious, cheap, easy to prepare in large quantities, and stable enough to work with military supply chains. He was not trying to impress anyone with the meals he prepared. He was simply doing his job according to standard procedures. Renate joined the conversation, her English still halting but improving. In Germany, she said carefully, tuna is luxury, only wealthy families before the war. Frank looked genuinely surprised. Really? Here it is just regular food, cheaper than most other proteins. You can buy it in any grocery store. The gap between their realities was laid bare in that simple exchange, revealing how profoundly different their material circumstances had been even before the war had begun to reshape everything. Christmas 1944 approached with a mixture of anticipation and melancholy throughout Camp Mitchell. Captain Sullivan wrestled with how to handle the holiday, knowing that many of her German prisoners would be experiencing profound homesickness compounded by the devastating news from their letters. She decided to allow the women to organize a modest celebration, providing materials for simple decorations and permitting them to sing traditional German Christmas songs if they wished. The decision was partly humanitarian and partly practical. Depressed prisoners were more difficult to manage than those given small outlets for cultural expression. Edith found herself designated as the unofficial organizer of the German Women's Christmas observance, a role that emerged naturally from her improving English skills and her ability to communicate effectively with both the American staff and her fellow prisoners. She approached Captain Sullivan with a carefully prepared request, speaking in slow but increasingly confident English. "Captain, may we sing for the American soldiers? German songs, but also we try to learn American Christmas songs?" The request surprised Sullivan, but she recognized the olive branch being offered and approved it immediately. The preparations became a project that united the German women in ways that daily routine had not. They practiced singing in the barracks during evening hours, teaching each other the harmonies they remembered from childhood. Inge, who had sung in a church choir in Berlin before the war, helped arrange voices and correct pitch. The familiar melodies brought comfort but also pain, reminding them of Christmases celebrated with families now dead, displaced, or unreachable. Still, they persisted, finding solace in the music even as it made them ache for what they had lost. Private Morrison volunteered to teach them Silent Night in English, working patiently with pronunciation that proved challenging for German speakers. The words felt strange in their mouths, familiar sounds transformed by a different language. Night became a struggle, the difficult English pronunciation of the vowel requiring repeated practice. Holy Infant became a tongue twister, but they worked at it with determination, wanting to offer something meaningful to the Americans who had shown them unexpected kindness during their months of captivity. The evening of December 23rd arrived with fresh snow covering the camp, creating a scene that could have appeared on a Christmas card if not for the wire fences and guard towers. The mess hall had been decorated with paper chains the women had made from old newspapers, and someone had found a small evergreen tree that now stood in the corner, decorated with ornaments crafted from tin cans and scrap materials. American soldiers and German prisoners gathered together, the usual separation between tables temporarily suspended for this special occasion. The German women stood together, 43 voices united in song. They began with O Tannenbaum, their voices harmonizing with the natural precision of their musical tradition. The German lyrics filled the hall, carrying memories of Christmases past when the world had been different, when war had been something distant rather than the consuming reality of their lives. Some of the American soldiers recognized the melody, if not the words, and a few hummed along quietly, creating an unexpected moment of shared cultural heritage. Then came Silent Night, attempted in careful English with pronunciation that was imperfect but sincere. Silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright. The words emerged hesitantly, each syllable a small act of courage. Round yon Virgin, Mother and Child, Holy Infant, so tender and mild. Their accents were heavy, some words nearly unrecognizable, but the intention was unmistakable. These women were trying to bridge the gap between enemy and human being, using the universal language of Christmas to communicate something that went beyond words. Private Morrison felt his throat tighten as he listened. He had written to his mother about these German prisoners, describing them as young women not so different from his sister and her friends back in Cedar Rapids. His mother had written back expressing skepticism, reminding him that these were the same Germans whose country had started the war, who had allied with Japan, who bore responsibility for untold suffering. But listening to them sing now, Morrison could not reconcile his mother's abstractions with the reality of these specific human beings standing before him, far from home, mourning their own losses, trying to make peace with enemies who had shown them unexpected mercy. The song concluded, and for a moment there was silence. Then the American soldiers began to applaud, slowly at first, then with genuine enthusiasm. Several of the German women were crying, though they maintained their composure and their formation. Captain Sullivan stood and thanked them formally, her voice carrying unexpected emotion. "That was beautiful," she said. "Thank you for sharing your traditions with us." Sergeant Chen translated, though by now many of the women understood enough English to grasp her meaning without assistance. The evening continued with American soldiers sharing their own Christmas traditions. One played harmonica, filling the hall with familiar carols. Another produced a worn deck of cards and taught some of the German women a simple game, using gestures and laughter when language failed. Frank, the cook, had somehow managed to produce cookies, real butter cookies with sugar sprinkled on top, a luxury that made several of the women weep at the taste of something sweet after months of deprivation. Edith found herself in conversation with Morrison, their exchange halting but meaningful. She tried to explain what Christmas had meant in Dresden before the war, the markets filled with handcrafted gifts, the smell of roasted chestnuts, the church services attended by her entire family, Morrison described Iowa Christmases with snow deeper than what they had here. His father reading the Christmas story by firelight, his mother's kitchen filled with the smells of baking that lasted for days. They were sharing memories of worlds that seemed impossibly distant, yet in the telling, those worlds became real again, briefly, in that mess hall decorated with paper chains and scrap metal ornaments. As the evening drew to a close, Renate approached Captain Sullivan with something she had been working on for weeks. It was a recipe carefully written in both German and her best attempt at English for traditional German Christmas cookies her mother used to make. She offered it shyly, explaining through Sergeant Chen that perhaps the American cook might enjoy trying it, or perhaps Captain Sullivan might want to send it to her own family. The gesture was small, almost insignificant, but it represented a profound shift in how these women viewed their captors and how they understood their own position in this strange new world. January 1945 brought news that shattered what remained of the German women's understanding of their homeland. American newspapers began publishing accounts of concentration camps being discovered as Allied forces advanced deeper into German territory. The reports were accompanied by photographs that seemed too horrific to be real, yet their authenticity was verified by multiple sources. Captain Sullivan debated whether to make these materials available to the prisoners, ultimately deciding that truth, however painful, was necessary for genuine transformation. The camp library became a place of reckoning. Edith sat at a wooden table, trembling hands holding a newspaper with images from Majdanek, recently liberated by Soviet forces. The photographs showed emaciated bodies stacked like cord wood, gas chambers disguised as showers, personal belongings sorted into massive piles. The accompanying article described systematic murder on a scale that seemed impossible. This was not collateral damage from warfare. This was deliberate, organized extermination of human beings whose only crime was their ethnicity or political beliefs or refusal to conform. Krista found her reading the article, tears streaming down both their faces. "Is this real?" Krista whispered in German. Did we really do these things?" Edith had no answer. She thought about her time in the Women's Auxiliary Corps, the pride she had felt in serving Germany's defense. She had believed the propaganda about protecting the homeland from hostile forces. She had accepted the explanations about why certain groups needed to be relocated for security reasons. She had never asked difficult questions because asking felt disloyal, and loyalty had been presented as the highest virtue. Other women gathered around the newspapers, their reactions ranging from disbelief to horror to desperate attempts at denial. Ing read the accounts with growing sickness in her stomach. She had processed communications from various military departments, including some from the SS. She had never questioned the euphemistic language used in those transmissions, the references to special treatment and final solutions that she had assumed meant relocation or imprisonment. Now those euphemisms took on a sinister meaning that made her complicit in ways she could barely process. Lore, the youngest of their group at 21, sobbed openly. "I did not know," she kept repeating. "I did not know." But Renate, sitting nearby, asked the question that would haunt them all. Should we have known? Were there signs we chose to ignore because acknowledging them would have been too uncomfortable? I remember neighbors disappearing, businesses closed, people whispered about who were never mentioned again. I told myself it was none of my concern, that the authorities knew best. Was that ignorance or willful blindness? The Americans watched from a distance as the German women grappled with these revelations. Private Morrison felt conflicted. Part of him wanted to offer comfort, but another part wondered if these women deserved comfort after what their country had done. Dr. Hayes, observing the scene, spoke quietly to Captain Sullivan. They are confronting something that most Germans have not yet faced. Whatever they were before, they are becoming something different now. The question is whether we help them through that transformation or leave them to drown in it. The arrival of spring 1945 brought both literal and metaphorical thawing at Camp Mitchell. The snow melted, revealing brown grass that would soon turn green. But more significantly, news arrived that Germany's defeat was imminent. Berlin was surrounded, Hitler's regime was collapsing, and the war in Europe would end within weeks. Captain Sullivan received orders from the War Department regarding repatriation procedures for the German women. Transportation would be arranged to send them back to their homeland once hostilities officially ceased. The announcement was made during morning assembly on May 2nd. Captain Sullivan spoke clearly, her words translated by Sergeant Chen, whose German had improved dramatically over the months. "Ladies, the war in Europe is ending. Within the coming weeks, arrangements will be made for your repatriation to Germany. You will be processed through displaced persons camps before being released to return to your homes." She paused, observing the complex emotions playing across the women's faces. Relief, anxiety, uncertainty, all mingled together in expressions that revealed how complicated the idea of going home had become. Edith felt her chest constrict. Home. The word had once meant something clear and simple. Now it represented a country she no longer recognized, a place that had committed atrocities beyond her imagination, a devastated landscape where her family struggled to survive. But more than that, home meant leaving this strange limbo where she had found unexpected kindness, where enemies had treated her with more dignity than her own government had treated its citizens. The thought of returning to Germany filled her with dread rather than anticipation. That evening, whispered conversations filled the barracks with new intensity. The women debated what awaited them in Germany. Reports painted a picture of complete devastation, cities in ruins, infrastructure destroyed, millions displaced, and a population facing starvation as the economy collapsed. The occupying forces would control everything, and Germans would be viewed with suspicion and hostility by the rest of the world. They would return as defeated enemies to a country that no longer existed in any meaningful sense. Krista spoke her fears aloud to Edith. "What if I go back and find nothing? My parents are alive, but living in a shelter. My brothers are missing. Our bakery is rubble. What life can I build there? Here I have been training with Dr. Hayes. He says I have a gift for nursing. He has taught me things I never could have learned in Germany. If I return, all of that knowledge becomes worthless. I will just be another displaced person in a sea of millions, all trying to rebuild from nothing." Inga voiced a different concern. "If we return, we will be seen as failures, soldiers who were captured, corrupted by enemy influence. The hardliners who survive will not forgive us for living in American captivity, for eating American food, for learning to see Americans as human beings rather than enemies. We will be suspect, possibly even punished, for our transformation." Renate raised the most painful question of all. Do we even deserve to stay? After what our country did, after what we were part of, even unknowingly, do we have the right to ask for mercy from the very people we fought against? May 15th arrived with unusual tension throughout Camp Mitchell. Captain Sullivan had called a General Assembly to announce the official repatriation procedures. The 43 German women gathered in the mess hall, their faces reflecting months of internal struggle about what this moment would mean. They had known this day was coming since the war's end had become inevitable. Yet knowing and experiencing proved to be vastly different things. The reality of departure forced decisions that could no longer be postponed or avoided. Captain Sullivan stood before them holding official documents from the War Department. Her voice was steady, but carried an undertone of compassion that had developed over the months of managing these unusual prisoners. "Ladies, I have received final orders regarding your repatriation to Germany. Transportation will be arranged within the next 3 weeks. You will be processed through displaced persons camps in Europe before being released to return to whatever remains of your homes." She paused, studying the faces before her. What she did not expect was what happened next. Edith stood slowly, her her hands visibly shaking despite months of growing confidence. In clear, careful English that bore only slight accent, she addressed the captain directly. "Captain Sullivan, may I speak for some of us?" Permission was granted with a nod. Edith looked around at her fellow prisoners, meeting the eyes of those who had agreed to let her serve as their voice for this unprecedented request. "We have been talking among ourselves for many weeks now," Edith began, her voice gaining strength as she continued. "Some of us, many of us, do not wish to return to Germany immediately." The words hung in the air like an unexpected thunderclap. Several American soldiers exchanged confused glances. Private Morrison, standing near the back of the hall, felt his breath catch. Surely he had misunderstood. Prisoners did not refuse freedom. That contradicted everything he thought he knew about captivity and liberation. Krista stood next, followed by Laura, Inga, Renata, and 19 other women. They formed a distinct group within the larger assembly, their decision clearly made after lengthy deliberation. Krista spoke in her improving English, each word carefully chosen. "Captain, we know what we ask is unusual, but Germany is not our home anymore. The Germany we served, we discovered, was not the Germany we believed in." The honest pain in her voice made several of the American soldiers shift uncomfortably, uncertain how to process this development. Captain Sullivan was momentarily speechless. In all her military experience, through managing hundreds of prisoners over the course of the war, she had never encountered anything remotely similar to this. Prisoners requesting to remain in captivity rather than accept freedom and repatriation. The legal implications alone were staggering, never mind the moral and philosophical questions it raised. She asked for clarification, needing to ensure she understood correctly what these women were actually requesting. What followed was an outpouring of emotion that revealed the depth of transformation these women had undergone. Edith explained, her voice breaking slightly, that they had lost everything that made Germany home. The response from Washington took 10 days to arrive, 10 days during which the camp existed in a strange state of suspended animation. The women who had requested to stay continued their daily routines with renewed intensity, as if their contributions might influence the decision being made by bureaucrats hundreds of miles away. They worked in the kitchen with extra diligence. They volunteered for additional duties. They practiced English with determination bordering on desperation. Everything they did carried the unspoken question: were they proving themselves worthy of the unprecedented mercy they had requested? Captain Sullivan had sent detailed reports explaining the situation, including character assessments of each woman who wished to remain. She described their genuine remorse upon learning about concentration camps, their transformation from defiant prisoners to contributors seeking redemption, and their legitimate fears about returning to a devastated homeland where they would face suspicion and possible persecution. She argued that allowing them to stay would demonstrate American values more powerfully than any propaganda campaign could achieve. Private Morrison had written his own letter to his congressman, describing what he had witnessed over the months. "These women are not our enemies anymore," he wrote. "They are people who got caught up in something bigger than they understood. They have shown genuine change, real horror at what their country did, and sincere desire to build better lives based on better principles. Sending them back to nothing seems wrong, seems like a missed opportunity to show what America really stands for." The reply from Washington was characteristically bureaucratic but unexpectedly flexible. The War Department would not prevent immediate repatriation for any prisoner who wished to return. However, given the unusual circumstances and ongoing chaos in occupied Germany, those who wished to remain could be reclassified as displaced persons and processed for potential immigration status. They would no longer be prisoners of war, but they also would no longer be guaranteed housing and support at the camp. They would need sponsors, employment, and housing in American communities willing to accept former enemy nationals. The announcement divided the women who had originally requested to stay. 8 decided the uncertainty was too great and chose repatriation. They would return to Germany and face whatever they found there with courage and hope, carrying with them the lessons they had learned about reconciliation. But 15 women, led by Edith, Krista, Ing, Laura, and Renata, chose to accept the challenge of starting completely new lives in America. It was a terrifying decision, made more so by its finality. Finding sponsors proved easier than anyone expected. Mrs. Henderson, a local school teacher who had been visiting the camp as part of church outreach, immediately offered to sponsor Edith. She provided housing and support while Edith sought employment as a translator. Dr. Hayes arranged for Krista to continue medical training at Worcester General Hospital, promising to supervise her transition from assistant to certified nurse. Other local families, moved by the women's story and their obvious sincerity, stepped forward to offer support and guidance. The communities that had initially been suspicious of having German prisoners nearby now embraced the opportunity to participate in what they saw as uniquely American story of redemption and second chances. 25 years after that first overwhelming dinner of tuna casserole, Edith Zimmerman Morrison stood in her kitchen in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, preparing the same dish for her own family. She had married James Morrison in 1947, a union that had seemed scandalous to some, but natural to those who had witnessed their gradual friendship develop during her months at Camp Mitchell. They had 3 children now, 2 sons and a daughter, all thoroughly American, yet raised with stories about their mother's complicated past. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, opening cans of tuna, cooking pasta, preparing the cream sauce that had once seemed like a miracle of abundance. The casserole was no longer special to her, just as it had never been special to Americans. It was Tuesday dinner, economical and filling, something she made twice a month just as Morrison's mother had done before her. But every time she prepared it, she remembered that November evening in 1944, when a simple meal had begun to crack open her understanding of the world. Krista had become Dr. Krista Newman, head nurse at Worcester General Hospital. She had never married, dedicating her life instead to healing others as a form of ongoing atonement for her country's actions during the war. She often spoke to community groups about forgiveness, transformation, and the possibility of redemption through changed behavior. Her story had been featured in several newspapers over the years, always emphasizing how American kindness had altered the trajectory of her entire life. Ing had married an American engineer and moved to California, where she worked as a technical translator for aerospace companies. Laura had become a school teacher, specializing in teaching English to immigrant children, using her own experience of language acquisition to help others navigate the challenges of assimilation. Renata had opened a small bakery in Boston, naming it Second Chances, and becoming known for bread that somehow combined German techniques with American ingredients, creating something entirely new. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of their story was how they maintained connections with those who had returned to Germany. Letters flowed across the Atlantic regularly, creating a network of women united by shared experience of transformation. Those who had returned often wrote about the challenges of rebuilding in devastated Germany, but also about how their time in American captivity had given them resilience and hope. Several had become leaders in German-American friendship societies, working to strengthen bonds between former enemies. The story of the German women who begged to stay had influenced American policy toward occupied Germany in subtle but significant ways. The success of their integration had demonstrated that treating former enemies with dignity could produce genuine transformation rather than simply breeding resentment. It had shown that redemption was possible when societies were willing to offer it, and that the most powerful victory over hatred was the transformation of enemies into friends. As Edith set the casserole on her dinner table and called her family to eat, she thought about that first meal and everything it had represented. She had mistaken ordinary American abundance for Easter dinner, a misunderstanding that now seemed almost comical. But that mistake had opened her eyes to a larger truth about the country that had captured her and then, against all expectation, had given her a second chance at building a meaningful life based on better principles than the ones she had been taught.